Hello, this is Dazzling One, and this week I will be covering the topic of the media and how it affects public opinion. The media has been referred to in the past as the Fourth Estate. This term arose from Thomas Carlyle's book Heroes and Hero Worship in 1841, but is originally attributed to Edmund Burke, a British politician. The media is a watchdog to the government, but it is also a watchdog to the people. With that in mind, conglomeration comes into play with the media, meaning that just like companies like Seagrams own gin, but they also own a record label, there's 6 gigantic corporations that own over 90% of the media. These 6 gigantic corporations are 21st Century Fox, CBS, NBC Universal, Time Warner, Viacom, Disney. When you look at it from the angle that there are only 6 major corporations that own over 90% of what we watch, especially when you consider news, then it puts into perspective how narrow the margin is of opinion as well as the diversity we have to pick from. Sociology has come up with explanations like the hypodermic needle or magic bullet, that the media can directly manipulate us, whether we know it or not. We feel that we need to buy the name brand over the off brand. Why buy ibuprofen when you can buy Advil because that's the name that's familiar? Or why buy Dr. Thunder when you can have Dr. Pepper, even if they taste nearly identical? Even the way we treat people and the way we view the world can be molded by the media according to this theory. They're subliminal messages. With encoding and decoding, it seeks to shift the blame more so from simply the media, but to the viewer as well, because in this theory, it's up to them to decode the message however they may. They don't have to accept the ideal that a television show or book supports domestic violence. This person can choose to look beyond it. Essentially, people who create disturbing content, let's say pornography or something violent, they will say this is what the people want. They have a choice. When they turn on the television, they choose to click into it, and we have way more people watching this show when we keep it on air than we have this show that might push a positive message. While these two theories do make sense to me, coming from the angle that I noticed that there is more satanic iconography as well as even the messages oftentimes mirror those of mythology, that means that they have to have some idea of what they're doing and the effects that it's having. Just take a look at all of the people who have a negative body image because of watching something on television, or they believe that a life of crime is going to lead them to opulence, which I would say there's still some personal responsibility. And this leads us into how are these stories, specifically for the news, selected? If you're looking at a local news channel, then there is a news director in charge of finding a story. People can bring any story to them that they want, but it has to be edited down to an appropriate length to be presented. As according to newsmedia.com, some criteria that they often adhere to is the proximity of the story. If you live in the Chicago area, then something that happens in San Francisco may not be as relevant to the people in the community. However, if it's some terrorist attack or some mass shooting, also, if you look at the Paris attacks, in the United States, it matters because France is one of the United States' allies, so they're going to continue to cover it. Whereas if you look at the Beirut bombings in Lebanon or the Nigeria bombings, because it's not a Western power, then they choose not to focus on it as much. It's about ratings, for one thing. There is also the idea of significance. How many people were affected? How significant is this to the viewer? They don't want them to change the channel since they're competing with other news sources, biting for our attention. A plane crash that kills 100 people is way more interesting to people than a plane crash that only killed a dozen, which then there's also prominence that comes into play. Famous people get covered more. If your next door neighbor overdoses on drugs, it's much more significant to people in the world to know about a celebrity than your next door neighbor because of the celebrity's notoriety and position. But what is unfortunate about this idea that it leaves marginalized parts of society out of the news, and when it comes to the perception of who the victims are and who the perpetrator is, it's often skewed. One example of this, when I looked into the media and its influences, was what some called the missing white woman syndrome. And what they mean by this is, most people, when they think of an helpless individual that's kidnapped, that image comes to mind. And the reason that this image is conjured up within their mind's eye is because when you look at the coverage that they gave to Natalie Holloway or Tracy Peterson, they're attractive from upper middle class homes, and although there are plenty of men and boys that go missing, although there are plenty of minorities and people from impoverished backgrounds, people tend to think this is what a victim is. And one fact to take into account is that statistically, according to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, there are as many as 100,000 active missing persons cases in the United States at any given time. And whenever they're adding up the numbers, oftentimes Hispanics are counted as white when it comes to being missing persons, and so that also factors into that number as well. And the explanation behind why they would want to cover, say, attractive white females over males or minorities, as according to a cable news employee, was, we showcase missing young white attractive women because our research shows we get more viewers. It's about beating the competition and dollars. Crystal Brent Zook, a professor at the Columbia University School of Journalism, stated, many consider women more sympathetic potential victims than men, and white women even more so. Who's appealing? Who's sexy? Observed Zook. The virginal pure blonde princess is missing. It has a lot to do with class and sexuality and ageism, not just race. And I agree with her assertion because even with age, there's this emphasis and worship of the youth, and oftentimes people tend to neglect the elderly, and they tend to focus on this ideal that women can only be victims, even though there are plenty of men that have been kidnapped, molested, and things that we often associate just with women. And according to another theory, there's an unconscious bias in the newsroom that leads journalists to assume that men or other members of society go missing all the time, and usually it has something to do with criminal activity. And their bias also can affect the public's bias, because if they saw some kind of suspicious activity where it wasn't involving the group that they view as the most vulnerable, they would most likely think nothing of it. The other factor to why they choose the story is that it has to appeal to human interest, meaning stories that appeal to emotion. They aim to evoke responses such as amusement or sadness. Television news programs often place a humorous or quirky story at the end of the show to finish on a feel-good note. Newspapers often have a dedicated area for offbeat or interesting items. But the downside to this, as you have all seen in the recent years, is that much of what we call news is fear-mongering and manipulation. One quote by Robert Anton Wilson in his article, Don't Be Afraid of Black Magic, and the section was entitled Psychic Assault. The so-called black magician is a new brain, hominid, fear merchant who has somewhere learned that there are more powerful intimidations than physical assault. The dimensions of horror, terror, and mind warp are discovered. You can scare more people and acquire greater power by the exploitation of psychic assault. When a human's mind or reality, the person virtually ceases to exist as human and regresses to the status of a terrorized mammal in a trap. Most people think magic is simply just spells, incantations, but it is manipulation, and we're seeing it constantly through the television screen. The language that they use to cover a story is key into how we react. It elicits an emotional response from us. Changing a word from aggressive to passive, saying something's intense, whether it's dull, can change the meaning of it. It can give the viewer a new picture. It can turn a villain into a hero, or vice versa. While some may point to the darker side, others may say that the fact that the news is censored is a positive thing because it can protect an individual's identity if they were raped, sexually assaulted, or it's a minor who committed a crime who they don't want to later have their life ruined because their face is plastered on television. They also say because they block out graphic images. However, even with that, images play a huge role. Sadly, images are abused and sometimes even fabricated. In Times magazine, they were caught showing Americans one cover while presenting a different one to the rest of the world. With the Smith-Mundt Act, it ensured for decades that government-made media intended for foreign audiences would not end up on radio networks broadcasted within the U.S. However, after an amendment tagged onto the National Defense Authorization Act, it removed that prohibition not too long ago. CNN is one of the most well-known news stations, and they've been caught faking news stories. If you Google CNN caught faking news segments, you'll come up with a barrage of videos. And one of the videos I remember, as the reporter is talking, you can see that the screen is malfunctioning and you can see the green screen. There was also the fake war coverage of the first Gulf War. There was also Nancy Grace and another anchor. They were supposed to be in two distant locations covering the Boston bombings, but you could see the same set of cars drive by both of them. Of people on YouTube have pointed to the fact that they use a lot of PSYOPs, psychological operations, and false flags to instill certain emotions to get us. Have you ever wondered why there's an increase in shootings over the past few years, and now they're talking about doing something about gun violence? Also with police brutality, it's been an issue for many years, but why is it now being brought to the forefront? What kind of agenda is being pushed with this? Or this idea that we now need to focus on the amount of rapes on college campuses. Why now, of all times? I'm not minimizing any of these issues, but there is a reason that these things matter now than they did 20 years ago to people, and it's not simply because the public opinion has shifted. Just like a reality show, news is scripted as well. News has been caught using the same dialogue if you just flip the channel. Conan O'Brien showed this in a video that he showed to his audience of all of these channels repeating verbatim the same set of lines. If you ever look at two opposing sides that are right-wing and left-wing, like MSNBC and Fox News, and you turn the channels, they are reporting from the same angle, but they put a different spin on that particular story to make it seem more left-wing or right-wing. News networks can pull something out of the air and then just simply make it disappear. Remember when people were going nuts about Ebola? They thought the world was going to end and that the next person who flew into their town could be infected, and now suddenly they don't remember what Ebola is. Well, that's the power of the media. They can make you fear one thing today and forget it tomorrow. You also have to take into consideration that public relations often sell a war to us. News can be propaganda. It can be disinformation or partial information reported as fact. There's also the reinforcement theory of people already have biases. If they tend to vote more conservative, they're going to turn on Fox because it reinforces what they already believe. They play off of these people's preconceived notions versus their beliefs. People tend to go and flock to what they already believe, and if someone is manipulating this information or lying about it, it is easy. You have your puppets on the string. Oftentimes, PR firms will feed stories to the press without revealing the nature of the information with the intention of creating a public opinion. There is also smear tactics, unfortunately, which can ruin a person's reputation. Have you ever seen a celebrity who just gets ran through the mud and they never recover? Probably because they went against someone in a high-powered position. They can mar someone's reputation and they can coerce them into doing what they want, and they will use the media if they have to. I used to want to be a journalist or a reporter when I was in kindergarten. That was the first job that I told my parents that I wanted to do. Now that I understand what a reporter has to do outside of just simply writing and speaking, there's no way I'd want to do it knowing what I know now unless I was doing it independently. And although they're trying to make a living, they're still the mouthpieces for these mega corporations who are pushing agendas. Journalists can be threatened if they try to go against those in power. They're not going to report on anything that would be damaging to any mega corporations such as pharmaceutical companies. Oftentimes they're paid off. If you saw the film Nightcrawler, In 2014, they had the phrase, "If it leads, it bleeds." It became the mantra throughout the whole film, and it conjured the media's obsession with swelling, hyped-up violent imagery, death, and fear. And lastly, when you look more towards entertainment, there is just the unrealistic expectations they set for you, like with the scripted news. So are our reality shows, and people should know that by now. But oftentimes people think that they can tell the difference, yet you see people trying to go out and get plastic surgery and buy things to make themselves look like people on TV. It goes back to people worshiping the affluent and wanting an opulent lifestyle, even if it doesn't resemble their life at all. Even with Photoshop, and even with advertisements, when they put out these unrealistic images, what is so daunting about it is you're taking already models, which there's a narrow margin for who can be a model based on height, weight, bone structure, and then you're using makeup on them, which already alters the appearance, and then you are photoshopping them and airbrushing them. So it's like the simulacrum, which is an image or representation of someone or something that's unsatisfactory, an imitation or substitute. There is no real copy. And if you watch The Matrix, Neo picks up a book that has the simulacrum on it, and they got this from this concept. But truly, too many people these days cannot differentiate between entertainment, reality. And sadly, it's because we've chosen style over substance, personality over policy, and people rather be entertained. This is why it's no longer about who says the most intelligent thing, who has the most honest plans, who makes the most sense. It's about who has the best soundbite. This is why constantly, right after there is some presidential debate, there is a parody to follow it up that keeps us in entertainment land, and it keeps us from thinking critically, and it keeps us from understanding what we're truly being bombarded with and what is really going on, and how, just as I said with red flags and psyops, these things can act as a smokescreen for what's really going on in the world. So you might ask, why do I care so much? Why should you care? And my answer to that is that simply manipulation is wrong. We as citizens deserve to know what is going on in the world and not be lied to, coddled, and misinformed about the circumstances of a situation. My word of advice is that we should never take anything to heart just because we simply hear it. And this includes me. Question the authenticity of it. Don't buy into everything you hear on television, see on social media, read in a newspaper. If you can, be your own reporter or follow alternative sources. There are more people who are live streaming at events, who are exposing how they are staging certain situations or photoshopping things. There are people on YouTube who expose false flags and psyops. There are sites out there. You can start your own to get other people to notice. Not everyone wants to think like this, and the majority of people would rather stay in Wonderland. But like I always say, start with questions. Point out the obvious holes in the mainstream media's lies and go from there. Those little steps can lead someone to even just begin to question. That's better than nothing, because we all deserve to know the truth, and we all deserve to understand what's truly going on. As Jesus said in John 8:32, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." I hope that you guys all have a wonderful week. Take care, and God bless you.